Dougherty, and I want to tell you about the history of Fountain City United Methodist Church. And I'm going to start at where we are, this piece of land that we're sitting on. There's a story behind it. It belonged to John Adair, and John Adair was a great patriot in our country and had a lot to do with the fact that the Patriots won the Revolutionary War. Times were bleak in 1781 when Cornwallis, the British general, was storming the South, having victory after victory. And George Washington was in the North fighting with Howe, the British commander there, in New York City. And so things looked bad. Cornwallis told everybody, he said, "You better surrender and be on King George's side, or I'm going to take away your farm." Oh, there were settlers that had settled in what's now Tennessee at Sycamore Shoals, now known as Elizabeth. And they were there in 1781, and they heard this. And did it ever fire them up? I can imagine. It's going to take away our farm? No, no, no. And so the huge number of them gathered, about 900 patriots. But they needed money to fund the expedition. That's why they came to John Adair. You see, he was the tax collector for the state of North Carolina. That's right. Before there was a Tennessee, this was all North Carolina. And John Sevier, who was the leading patriot, along with Evan Shelby, they cornered John Adair and said, we need money to pay for gunpowder and other supplies, and we're going to go attack Cornwallis. And so he said, "I'm going to give you money, but I have no authority to do this," he says, "so I'm going to make sure that if we beat the enemy, we will pay this money back." So on October 7th, 1780, 900 patriots went up the mountain to fight Lord Cornwallis. And I suppose the British Army was amazed to see these rugged pioneers coming out of the wilderness. Some had hardly any clothes, just rags torn together, and some had buckskin that they were wearing, and they were a motley-looking crew, and they laughed at the Patriots when they saw them. And then the shooting began, and it was an enormous massacre for the Patriot Army because they destroyed about 90% of the British who had come to fight them at Kings Mountain. So then the British escaped in whatever way they could and joined Cornwallis, and Cornwallis said, "Let's go spend the winter at this place called Yorktown." And George Washington heard what was happening. So he immediately left New York, marched his army in a couple of days, 24 hours a day. They marched and marched till they lined up and blocked Cornwallis on the York Peninsula. And then Howe thought he'd send his British ships down, but the French Navy came and they blocked them off. So Cornwallis had to surrender. So John Adair was behind the effort to get us to be a country. And so a gracious state of North Carolina gave him a land grant in 1788 for 1 square mile. Today, we're located on that same property. It went all the way from what is now Lyndhurst Cemetery up here to Fountain City Park. It wasn't called by those names in that day, of course. This was wilderness. 1 square mile. And they told him, "We want you to build a depot for the Cumberland Guard." That was a group of North Carolina soldiers who were going to protect pioneers who were coming into the country. And down where Lyndhurst Cemetery is, he called it Grassy Valley. he was a famous man. He was a part of Knoxville's first city government. He was a founding member of First Presbyterian Church, the oldest church in Knoxville. He was a founding trustee of Blount College, which later became the University of Tennessee. And he even went to the Southwest Territory Legislature in 1792. And he either bought or sold, it's not quite clear, 1 acre to Fountainhead Methodist Church. And so in 1825, the preachers began preaching at Fountainhead, as it was called in those days. So we're going to look at the history of our church. For the first 65 years, it was very rural. After that, it became what I'd call a town church, and after that, a suburban church, and today, really, a city church. So this is the story of our church. And so here are the dates for when the names changed. At first, it was Methodist Episcopal Church. In 1844, it became Methodist Episcopal Church South, and then Fountain City Methodist Church, 1890, and finally, in 1968, it became the United Methodist Church. And here's kind of a layout of what he was doing. I'll see if I can get my laser printer going here. Okay. So John Adair owned roughly from here up to here, this square area right there, 1 square mile where we are and now called Fountain City. His grave is there in Lyndhurst Cemetery, right under the big oak tree that's closest to the east side of Lyndhurst. That little knoll there is a big oak tree we're standing under, and here's Food City down in the bottom. The Southwest Territory that was founded in 1792, it was basically what is now the state of Tennessee, but it was called the Southwest Territory. All this country here was Indian country. It was reserved for the Cherokees. Well, our ancestors weren't too nice to the Cherokees. They drove them off eventually. But this was what it looked like in that day. So when our church began in 1825 as a preaching station, at first they worshiped outdoors. The building that you see, and this, by the way, is an artist's rendering, we don't know exactly what it looked like, was a very small one-room building where they could come out of the weather in the winter to hear the preacher preach. And the location is where my car is, right up here. And here is Fountain City Lake, which wasn't a lake then. It was a marsh. Under this little building here is a big spring. As I drove down Broadway this morning, the door was open. I didn't have time to stop and look in, but I just like to look in and see what it really looks like. But now the numbers down here refer to things that are in the book. We have this history book written, and here it is. It's a 20-page booklet about the history of our church. And we're referring right now to page 2, which is in the book right there. So when the pioneer preachers would meet there, they were circuit riders. The people did not have hymnals, but he had a hymnal. And here is a United Methodist or a Methodist hymnal from the early days, and it's kind of battered. The cover's about to come off of it. But what the preacher would do is he would line it out. And I'm looking at the first hymn in this 200-year-old hymnal. And by the way, it's the first hymn in our hymnal today. And he would line out, "Oh, for 1,000 tongues to sing." And then they would sing, "Oh, for 1,000 tongues to sing. Hit my great Redeemer's praise." And then they would sing that. It'd be lined out back and forth, presented and repeated by the people. And there were many stanzas. This one here has 6 stanzas here. And they would stand up and line it out just like that. In the days before they built the little log cabin, this was outdoors. And they hoped it didn't rain. I guess that was the thing. They might go to somebody's house if it did. Now, what John Wesley urged was that they have class meetings. So they formed a Methodist class or a Methodist society, as they were called, and they would meet in homes when the preacher wasn't there. So it doesn't mean that when he did his circuit, it took him a whole month to get around to his circuit because he had all Knox County. They would have worship in somebody's house, and they would have prayer meeting there. They would pray for each other's, and John Wesley prepared a bunch of questions they're supposed to ask each other, to question each other on their spiritual life. So, moving right along then into the 1800s, about 1833, they started having camp meetings in this area that we now call Fountain City Park. It wasn't a park then, it was a wilderness where it was cleared enough that they could gather a crowd. And so they started meeting there, and it became a big deal. Pioneers would come from all over in their covered wagons and spend several days at a camp meeting. Here is a picture. Looking at the clothes, I think it was probably maybe just after the Civil War or just before it. The tents are pretty good, substantial tents, too, so it was in the later period, I guess. Now, a tragedy happened in 1844. The Methodist Church split. The issue was slavery, of course. In the Methodist Episcopal Church, the churches and the conferences that were in the south part of the country, basically what later became the Confederate States when the Confederacy was formed, they formed the Methodist Episcopal Church South. Well, John Wesley was against slavery, and most Methodists frowned on it. But in the South, they didn't speak against it too strongly. You know why. There were plenty of their plantations around where people owned slaves, and I guess they didn't want to be offensive. So about that same time, in 1845, another building was built, and they moved it from the west side of what's now the lake to the north side of the lake where our church building stands today. This is the very spot where they built the white church among the mighty trees. There is no photograph of it, but it was a much bigger church. It was a white frame church. It was basically one room, I think, but they probably put curtains up. They wanted to have a children's meeting or a youth meeting while the adults were somewhere else. But this was about 1845. And one of the famous preachers in that era was Thomas Stringfield. And he was our pastor in 1833 and also in 1851. Not just of our church. He had the entire Knox County. He was a circuit rider and went from one church to another. And he was very prominent. He was a powerful speaker. And many things were written about what a great preacher Stringfield was. But every now and then they'd bring him up on charges that when they'd gather for Holston Conference because they accused him of owning 10 slaves. And some thought that was really not appropriate for a preacher to own slaves. His answer always was, no, they belong to my wife. And I guess for us today, it's hard to figure, why did they justify owning slaves? So think about it for a minute. There's several answers. One thing is it was just the way things were. People didn't question it very much until the time of the Civil War. Jesus didn't forbid it. Paul urged slave owners to be kind to their slaves, and he urged slaves to obey their masters. And they often said, our slaves are better off here than they were in Africa. I really think that's a lie. Some might have been, but honestly, to be a slave was very degrading in the South before the Civil War. And they said, we're inherently superior. Well, we've tried to stamp out racism as much as we can. No, we don't pretend that one race is better than another. Now, a typical preacher in that day was somebody who became very famous. Now, I'll admit, he did not preach here at Fountain City. This was not one of his churches. but he was a local preacher. For a while, he ran a circuit, but he decided to get married. And his wife said, "I want you to stay at home, I guess." And so he set up camp, and he had a printing press, and so he printed up a little newsletter, and he was very opinionated, and he talked all the time about how great Methodism was and how bad the Baptists and Presbyterians were. He was a Unionist. He was very much against the Confederacy, and in East Tennessee, most people were Unionist, as a matter of fact. And so at the end of the Civil War, he organized the M.E. Church, which was the original name before they added South to it. He got it reorganized. Everybody went to a big meeting, and a whole bunch of churches came out of the M.E. South and formed the M.E. Church. So even up to 1939, there were two separate denominations in this area. He was what you call a radical Republican. So when Andrew Johnson became vice president on Abraham Lincoln's ticket in 1875, it so happens that W.G. Brownlow was elected governor, and it was the most lopsided majority in the history of Tennessee. He won 23,300 to 30. You say, how could that have happened? Well, he had the Union Army patrolling all the voting places, for one thing. So that's how the radical Republicans won East Tennessee. They've been pretty strong here ever since, as a matter of fact. Moving right on. After the Civil War ended, there was a lot of interest in churches to build extra rooms where they could have Sunday school. Now, they were beginning to fade out where they had class meetings in homes, and they thought, wouldn't it be better in our church if we didn't have maybe we had a children's room and a youth room and an adult room. So after the war, this Sunday schools started increasing. Keep that in mind. And camp meetings declined. Times had changed. And in 1890, wow, this is famous in Fountain City history. Everything changed in Fountain City. So I call it the day of the town. Fountain City is a town. Just before 1890, in 1886, they started building a big hotel just up above the spring in what is now Fountain City Park. And in 1888, they actually built Hotel Road that went from where Broadway is now. Broadway wasn't there yet, but just a road that went up to the hotel. If you wanted to get here, by the way, you could take Jacksboro Pike, which really wasn't a road, much of a road, but it was a road, Jacksboro Pike, and then you would take Rennock Road. If you know Fountain City, it's Connor spelled backwards. It was the bottom part of the Connor farm. So they took a Rennock Road, which came down toward the swamp, which became the lake very soon. And so that's how Hotel Road got built. And in 1890, the folks that built the hotel said, well, we need a railroad. And before we had a real road coming to Fountain City, before there was Broadway, can you believe it? People got here by train. So they built the dummy line. It went from about where Old Gray Cemetery is, downtown Knoxville, out here, and ended at where Fountain City Park is. And to this day, you can go in Fountain City Park and you can see the loop there at the end of the park where the train turned around. It's still there. And in 1890, they built a dam to get the water that was coming out of that big spring where the church was first founded. And they created the heart-shaped lake. And in 1890, our church became a station. Now, in Methodist terms, we were a circuit. We were on the Knoxville circuit, where one preacher served many churches. But now we had our own preacher. So this is a big move forward. And so they built the English style church, as it's called, in 1890. And in 1892, the new building they just built burned to the ground. Oh, and so then they had in 1893 to build the so-called Akron Plan church building. We'll say more about it in a minute. Here's the big guy himself, Colonel Woodward. He was a Kentucky colonel. No, I don't think that means he fought in the military. I think a Kentucky colonel was somebody who was rich and got that name. But anyway, he had a pile of money and he came down here and bought 395 acres and cut it into lots. And those lots have houses standing on them today, many of which were built in the 1890s, some of our older homes. So Colonel Woodward built himself a big house out on Broadway. Now, some of you may remember it. I remember when this big house was torn down about 1980. It was a beautiful thing, and Fountain City residents tried to raise enough money to save it, but Walmart or somebody, whoever bought it, Kmart, they outbid us, and so the house was torn down. But that's Woodward, who alone was the founder of Fountain City. He was a famous man. Here's a picture of the English-style church building, and I'll tell you where I'm getting the picture. This is the only picture known to exist of the 1890 building, and it's in an advertisement for Holbrook College. Holbrook College was up the hill where Gresham High School, where Gresham Middle School is now, and later became Central High School. Here's the hotel right here. I'll show you a picture in a second. And here is the church. And down here is the station. So you'd ride your train in and you could go to church. You could walk up to the hotel, or if you're staying in a hotel, it's a nice church to go to, was right here. Only picture we had. Now on the other side, this is a picture of Holbrook College. And here was a picture of it when it became Central High School. They remodeled the building, okay? And then here is Fountainhead Hotel. Like we said, it began in 1886 and it burned in 1920. It was a summer-only resort. So they worked things out with Holbrook College. In the off-season, it was a dormitory for Holbrook College, a girls' college. And assuming the girls took good care of it, when they left for the summer recess, became a hotel, and rich people from Knoxville rode the train out because Knoxville was too hot in the summertime. Now, I well remember, because I grew up in Knoxville before air conditioning, and I remembered we would have all our windows open and a big window fan at one end of the house trying to get the air to come through. All right, to continue, here is a picture of the stairway going from the fountain, the big Fountain City spring right down here. It's still there, up to the hotel. Now, I'm sorry to say there's all kinds of brush and underbrush and garbage and I don't know what all in our creek. I wish we could get some volunteers together and clean it up. But here is the big spring in Fountain City Park when it was a part of the original settlement of Fountain City. And isn't it interesting? Here's an old postcard that was made in the 1890s. And here's another scene. And here's some people standing around the spring, which was then dammed up and made into a lake, Fountain City Lake. And right up above it is where I was pointing out that our first preaching services were held on the side of this bank here, where we had that little log cabin. So here's a modern picture of Fountain City Lake, and you can see that it's heart-shaped. Well, now I may confess, I've known Fountain City Park when I was a child. My family came out and played in the park when I was a youngster, where I was growing up in Knoxville. But I never knew it was a heart-shaped park, lake, but there it is. So here is the original map from 1890. Not all of the lots were built as marked on the map, I must say. But this was what Woodward did. He made these lots out, and they both basically still exist to this day. And here is the Connor family farm, and it's the lower side of the Connor farm where there was a trail going out to this, which is this line right here, is what we now call Jack Sparrow Pike. It was a very rough country road, probably not paved at all. Maybe you had to ford creeks, etc. So we're talking about the year 1890. So in 1892, when the church burned, we built a new church building. It was called Akron Plan because it really started in Akron, Ohio. Somebody there built a church which had a central sanctuary, but it had classrooms around the side. So you could pull the curtain and go behind your own classroom if you wanted to. Or on Easter, you could pull all the curtains back and it could all be seating capacity for a big church. So this is the 1892 picture, and here's the 1921 picture. What's different? Look at this tower right here. Now I'm going to go back. Look at the tower then. We added classrooms and another wing onto the building in 1921, just 30 years after the first building had been built. Looking at a floor plan for it, if you go into the sanctuary, go up the steps into the sanctuary, the ladies' parlor had this area right behind the sanctuary. And then the juniors were over here, and they had extra classrooms as breakout rooms over here. The choir room was here, preacher's office was there, and the secretary's office was there. Secretary, yeah, that came in the area after 1920 when the church was growing and they built the annex and all. They needed somebody there to do the bulletin and be there occasionally for when the building needed to be open. Now, so here's a picture of the park. This building down here is kind of like the building we have there now at the corner of the park, and the trains would go right out through here. They'd pass the park, go over here, and circle around. Here's this couple. They're having a get-together there in the park, aren't they? Okay, and here's another picture, probably about the same time. If I look at this dress here, that's maybe about 1900, when women wore dresses like that. And let me show you the train. Here is the dummy train. Now you're going to say, why did they call it the dummy train? Well, it was a steam engine here, but they enclosed it to fool the horses so they wouldn't really think it was a steam engine. You know, I really think horses are smarter than that. But anyway, here's another picture of the dummy. And this is probably going toward Lyndhurst Cemetery in the space that later in 1906 became Broadway when they extended it out. But at first, Fountain City was a railroad town. Isn't that amazing? And here is the corner at Hotel Road. It may be the same building that's there now. It sure looks like it a lot to me on the south side of Hotel Road, which would be right here. Broadway would be going up through here, but the train track is still there. Okay, and there's a horse and buggy you see there. And over here is a little later thing, and here's a drawing of the station, which was right over here, the train station. And I don't have a picture handy, but there are pictures that exist of big crowds of men in their suits waiting for the morning train so they could go to work down there in Fountain City. So in 1906, a streetcar came in. I don't know if you can read it or not, but it says here Fountain City Express. And I believe that's when they paved Broadway and put the train tracks in the middle. Let me mention Macmillan. Now, I know I'm going back to 1844 because that's when it started, but this is about that same period of time. James McMillan bought a big farm west of what later became Fountain City. And in 1844, he was famous for planting cedar trees all up and down the road. And this picture is from about 1910, I think. It's hard to tell. But if you notice in the picture, here's part of Cedar Lane, now Cedar Lane, that went out there toward the McMillan place. And here's another picture of it, probably looking back east. And look, here's his house. It's still there. And it's called Magnolia Manor today. And this is where J. Howard Carnes lived. Now, I've got to say, the Carnes family was really active in our church. Mrs. Carnes was the founder of the Women's Society in our church. J. Howard Carnes owned a saddle and harness shop on Gay Street. In 1919, I think he realized, hey, you know, this thing about motor cars is coming in for good. So I think he sold out at the right time and moved out here into what was the old McMillan place. His wife was the granddaughter of the McMillan that I showed you earlier. But here's J. Howard Carnes, very famous man in the history of our church. And he was a gentleman farmer. Notice he's wearing a suit here, feeding the chickens. And he's probably got all these farmhands up here working for him. And some of the women came out to help with the hay crop, it looks like. And if you stood at his house and you looked toward Knoxville in 1915, this is what you would see. Duh, that's his farm. Where's Inskip? You have to wait. It had not been settled in the early 1900s. This was a rural community, and Fountain City became a little city in the midst of the rural community. By the way, it was Fountainhead, and when they applied for a post office in 1890, the post office said, somebody's already got the name Fountainhead. You can't have it. So they said, okay, we'll rename it Fountain City. And that's how we got the Fountain City name. Now there's a cemetery. If you go up Hotel Avenue and turn left on Holbrook and go to the end of Holbrook, it would say right here that this is the McMillan Carnes Cemetery. And over here are the graves of the Carnes family. And the church got it in 1917. And the other pillar over here mentions Fountain City United Methodist Church Cemetery. Well, the Carnes' graves up here face toward the east. So as you rise out of your grave was the old idea, you would face the east. Christ would come from the east. And over in this section, they face Astor Road. So I guess we'd changed our thinking by then. And why not line up the graves straight with the street? So the Fountain City part is that. Both parts, if you're a part of the Carnes family, you can still be buried here. And our church is glad to sell you a grave over on this side, and we give a pretty good deal for it too, I think. I got his picture on page 4, but I'm keep trying to keep this in date order. It was not until 1932 that Fountain City Park became a park. The church owned it for the camp meetings, but then we sold it to the hotel after we realized the camp meetings were over, when they built the hotel. And then there was somebody that drew up a plan to cut it into lots and sell property there. And the church members were incensed. And one of our church members was Judge Green. He managed to put it through his court that would be a park in perpetuity. It will always be a park. It's tended by the Lions Club, but as I understand it, it's now a city park. And so I think it's city crews that come out and cut down trees if they fall or something like that. Okay, just going to talk a little bit as we go on into the 1940s, and I'm moving on to page 7 in the book. I want to mention one pastor who was very, very important, in my opinion, because my heart goes out to anybody who is a historian. And on page 7 there's a picture of I.P. Martin. Isaac P. Martin was the district superintendent of the M.E. Church South, and he retired from being superintendent and assigned himself to a local church. He said, I'll take Fountain City. So he came out and he was our pastor during the Depression. And in the little history book he wrote about our church, he doesn't really mention what he did. But I'll tell you, the church was very active. For in his time, Fountain City Church had about 1,000 members when he retired in 1940 and we got a new pastor. To me, he's very important because he helped in 1939 bring the two denominations together, the M.E. Church and the M.E. South. He was one who was instrumental in getting that job done. So we became the Methodist Church then, not yet United Methodist. We just called it Methodist Church. So when I grew up in the 1940s, it was the Methodist Church that I was a part of. Okay, so here's where we are. We're going to look at the suburban church, which is the word I call it. That's just my terminology. You might want to call it something different. But Knoxville, Fountain City was really a suburb of Knoxville, I think, in those days in many, many ways. And so we're going to take 60 years, beginning from 1940 up to the year 2000. And one of the preachers I'll mention was Clyde Watkins. I never met I.P. Martin, but beginning with Clyde Watkins, I do indeed remember him. And he served during the war. It was a tough time for all churches. Many of our young men were in service. And so it was really tragic. I think we had 2 that passed away while they were in the military. And Clyde Watkins was here when carrying on and getting things really moving during the war. He was popular. He managed to build a large and very active church, all serving out of the little red brick building that we had. And they kept complaining, we need to do something about this. T. Paul Sims came in 44, and he's famous because there were lots of stories about him. He was very strict. He didn't allow dancing, and he used to preach against dancing, and the teenagers in the church by 1944 weren't sure dancing was anything wrong with it. He forbade our young people to go to jitterbug things up on at Central High School or something like that. And he also preached against racing because they were having races in halls on Sunday. And so he got up in church on Sunday and prayed for rain. And the showers came down in a torrent. And the headline of the paper the next day said, "Preacher wins." He managed to get the racing canceled. But anyway, he built the first of the buildings which still stand on this site. It's the back part of the building. The 1949 building was built by him. Moving right along, he was followed by Woody Stone, and Woody Stone was a very popular preacher. He served our church with distinction and was getting everything ready for a big movement where we would move ahead with the next preacher. When he left in 1954, he went to Second Methodist in Knoxville, which was then, their preacher had been George Cresswell. Cresswell had been there the longest I've ever heard of any Methodist preacher. He served 40 years in that one church. And people kept saying, we dread who's going to have to follow him. But Woody Stone went to hold it together, and I appreciated what he did. One person, I had the privilege of knowing him when I was a teenager, and it was Frank Porter. And he was here from 1954 to 1959. And he was here during the time when we had the big building project that got started and built building after building in the same pattern that you see now. Uh, so what he decided was a major plan for this. He, he decided what they would do in 1956 was build the new Fellowship Hall. I know we call it the old Fellowship Hall today, but it's the new one. That wing was built off of the old brick church. And so that when they built the brick church, they could tear the brick church down and have worship for a while in the old Fellowship Hall. Bear in mind that this, the stage was there because that's where the pulpit was, but the choir was not there. No risers or anything like you see in it today. The Fellowship Hall then was a fairly big space to have worship, and I remember that when the whole space was being used. So he talked about building the new building, and he told me he was surprised that the congregation went along with him. He said, I thought I'd never talk. They loved that little brick church so much, but he said, there are too many issues. We need to take it down and rebuild. So in May 5, 1957, they called it the Day of Remembering, and there was a candlelight procession from the old building to the new Fellowship Hall. It was led by Mr. Hall and Reverend Bill Dykes, Mrs. Moore, and Mrs. Haynes. And the slogan was Lighting the Future with inspiration from the past. And it took a while to get it built, a year and a half, before they were able to have a service in the new sanctuary. Here's a clipping of the people coming out of the red brick church carrying their candle lights in procession as they marched around the building and went into what is now the old Fellowship Hall. So when it was finished, here's a picture of the 1958 building. And I well remember this here because the church ended at this point. There was a big parking lot beside it and a couple of old houses they hadn't yet torn down, but later tore down, and more buildings were built in the future. But this is what it looked like um, when the new building came about during Porter's time. So Joyce and Justine were very famous for singing at about every wedding held here, I declare. And if they hadn't sung for one wedding, I wouldn't have this next picture because this is the only picture I could find of H. Olin Troy, who was here from 1959 to 1962. And if anybody will listen to me, I'll tell you, yeah, it's worked for 60 some years, but I'll just tell you personally, when you're 21 years old, you're too young to get married. There you go. And there's Troy. I was good friends with his son, by the way, who was in my class at Emory and Henry and later on in seminary. I knew him very, very well. The After him, we had Chilcote, and during Tom Chilcote's time, they dedicated the new building that had been built for the church, and it was quite a ceremony. The bishop was here, and District Superintendent Ogle was here, and uh, Bishop Finger was the bishop in our time, and District Superintendent Ogle. So this building connected with the old one, and so Chilcote really brought it in. He was a very intelligent person, and he left here to become president of Emory and Henry College. He wrote a number of books. Very, very smart guy. And when you talked to Chilcote, you knew you were speaking to a brain, for sure. So after his time, Gordon Sturkey came. And Gordon Sturkey was a very pious man, a very faithful man, deep thinker. His wife, by the way, made a scrapbook of every congregation they served in Holston Conference. And that was very helpful to me because I borrowed Mrs. Sturkey's scrapbook from the conference archives so I could see what was happening in our church during his time. And one of the things that I want to point out to you that you may not know about, but in the 1970s, this would not have surprised you at all. A very important member was Jane Merchant. Let me tell you about Jane. The Merchant's family owned property out west of here, for which Merchant's Road is named. That was their farm. But Jane, the great poet and writer, from the age of 11, was an invalid. It's hard to imagine being bedridden for years and years. And this is her sister, Elizabeth. Oh, thank God for caregivers. I have seen caregivers who were so wonderful, and they kept people alive. But not only did she do that, but Elizabeth helped her write these poems. Jane Merchant had 3,000 poems published. And so they started out when she was about, she was a teenager, about maybe 12, 13. Elizabeth thought, well, that poem you wrote's nice. So she sent it to the Saturday Evening Post, and they published it and sent her back $50. And so she started, every time Jane would write a poem, she would send it in. So not only did she have 3,000 acceptances, get this, she had 6,000 rejections. I think that would slay me to have 6,000 rejections, but let me tell you, a lot of that's the same poem. She would send it to one. If they didn't like it, she'd send it to another one. If they didn't like it, Elizabeth would send it to another one. So that one poem may have been to 8 different publishers before it ever got published. But this story is just amazing. And Gordon Sturkey had her funeral at Bookwalter Cemetery, as a matter of fact, because she lived out that way, very close to Bookwalter Church. One of our most famous members you've never heard of, probably, but very great in her time and a true saint in our church. The next pastor was Ed Eldridge. Ed was a very good friend of mine. I got to know him well, and also his sons, who were Knoxville lawyers and very active in our conference. And his wife belonged to my church when I was pastor at Washington Pike, and I had her funeral. Ed Eldridge was just a great, wonderful preacher. And I remember hearing Bishop Finger preach here for him. And it was in his time in 1978 that we became debt-free and paid off our notes for the previous buildings. Watch out, Fountain City. You get debt-free, and the next preacher's going to think of something else for you to build. But anyway, we were debt-free, and one of our associate pastors there was Dindy Taylor. Her name was really Mary Virginia, but everybody called her Dindy. And she later became a bishop of the United Methodist Church and became our bishop in the 20-teens. After Eldridge's time, our pastor was John Trundle, and I remember Trundle very well because he was a good friend of mine. He was very interested in missions. He was chairman of the missions committee of the conference. And when I was organizing many teams to Mexico, John would help me with that organization and contacts with the Board of Missions and other agencies. And I appreciated that very special concern that he had for missions. Now, it was Trundle that got us to have the early service, the 9:30 service. Because, do you remember, in the 1980s, we had the World's Fair here in Knoxville? Well, Trundle decided we needed to have a World's Fair service where people could go to church and then go to the World's Fair. And it became very popular. There's some Sundays when we have more in the early service than we do in the 11 o'clock. But anyway, Trundle got that started, and I appreciate that. He's also got Gene Payne on the staff to lead a lot of singles programs and couples programs. We were very big into having things that people could do together, and the church was kind of like the YMCA in a way, where there are all kinds of meetings are held here. We're still that way. Community gatherings take place in the church, and a lot of that happened because of Trundle's leadership. Then in 1985, Spurgeon McCart came to be our pastor. And I'm sorry that's an old picture of him. That's a more recent picture. He looked younger then, but Spurgeon was a fine man. I remember him very, very well. And during his time, an announcement appeared that we were breaking ground for a new building. And it was going to be a gymnasium, a kitchen, a community room that I'm in at this very moment, by the way, a youth center, and a new office complex. And this started during Spurgeon's time. Beginning in the here's a show you a picture. This is what they were building. As long as I got that up, I think I'll show you the map of the property. So, right out here, here's the first building still standing, 1949. Then they built the new fellowship hall, now the old fellowship hall, which is right here where the congregation worshiped until they finished the sanctuary in 1958 and got that. And the entrance right here, by the way, these numbers are entrances. Entrance number 1 comes into our narthex, and that was built in 1958 also. And then in 1965, they built this addition of more classrooms in the back, 2-story classrooms. And during that time, the chapel right here was also built. Then in 1989, that's when we built the big fellowship hall, the gym, and we built this row of classrooms right across the door from it, which was supposed to be for youth at that time. But sometimes we change what we're doing with the rooms. And secondly, we built a chapel right out here. So these buildings came in late. So that's your schema of when the different buildings of our church was built. Now, we did renovations with other pastors. So in 1990, Bill Kilday came. Very good friend of mine who I've known since the 1950s. And he turned in a lot of things he did. It's on pages 9 through 11 in the book. One of the key things he did was they changed the church sanctuary. And all the church architects warn you, don't change the sanctuary, it gets people mad. Well, Bill said, and I put this in the book here, that when they changed the sanctuary from having a divided chancel with the altar against the wall, the sections of the choir faced each other, we changed it with the choir facing forward, and changed the railing there at the front also. One man told Bill, they managed to finish it in 1 week, by the way. Carpenters came in on Sunday after church, and they started tearing things out. And by church time the next Sunday, they'd finished. A 1-week construction. And one man said, well, I hate this. You've ruined my church. And then Bill said, about a month later, he came back and said, you know what, preacher, I think I like this. I think it's going to be all right. And so we come now to the end of the century. Now, a lot of you who will be viewing a video like this probably know the end of the century and the year 2000 better than I do. But anyway, I want to just cover what I see is happening. It's what I call the city church. So we're a little bit different yet. We're dealing with a lot of issues that have to do with the fact that we are a metropolitan area, a city, where there are people with addiction, people with troubles, people that need the facilities of a church like ours. So during this period of time, our here are our 21st century pastors. And I will mention a few things about them just briefly in passing, but as I say, you may know this history better than I do. During Pete Rowlett's time, the preschool got organized and authorized. What do you call it? Their credentials as a validated preschool. So we have one of the great preschools of our town housed in this building, and that was started during Rowlett's ministry. Also, during that time, we had our 175th anniversary in the year 2000, and that was a great occasion in our church. There was a video, This Is My Story, featuring interviews with people about the history of the church at that time. Still an interesting video to see. And the big celebration was in August of that year. The Journey was founded in the first part of this century. It's changed a lot since it was first founded, but it began the first service in the year 2000. And so it's a very important part of our church today. Um, John Gargis was very important in getting that move made, and also working with CR in getting that move made. And so CR and the Journey began, and they have made improvements and changes through the years, but it started then. And did you know that the famous singer Casey Ballerini sang in our choir? Oh, just telling, in case you didn't. During Jim Whedby's time, Jim was here for 10 years as pastor, and he's still here as a silent retired pastor. It's hard to get Jim to say anything about the church because he said, I'm no longer the pastor. You talk to the real pastor. But Jim is a wonderful person to be around. And during his time in the book, I put in some of the things that were written by Melissa Smith about the ping pong playing pastor. She said Jim was left-handed, so he had a terrible curve when he would serve ping pong, and he was really hard to beat. And I remember that there were ping pong tournaments here when Jim and Melissa were here, and when Don was also the associate pastor. Celebrate Recovery began when John Gargis called Randy Fry. So Randy's the next person here. And Randy was very eager to see this church be a home for CR, and very good move. The official founding of it was August of 2012 when it was set to move out here. And it deals with people who need to work with others on handicapping conditions, addictions, etc., hang-ups. A very good program. It is one of our best social action programs. We have a fantastic CR in our church. And Tom Ballard had the unlucky appointment to be here when COVID came and we had to shut down because of a national resolution when the President of the United States asked all churches to close briefly. So we were shut down for a month, and Tom got in the habit of doing videos. He was very good at videos. He would sit down and have a heart-to-heart talk with you, and he was just great. It was put on our YouTube site and our regular church website, and Tom had a great ministry that way during rebuilding in what was actually a very tough time for every church in this country. Many members left churches and just didn't come back. Either they didn't recover health well enough to come back, or just got out of the habit of coming. It's a good habit. Don't quit coming. I think it's a great thing to do. So now our pastor is Don. And Don Hanshu has a very forward-looking article in the newsletter, the history that I wrote. I hope you'll be sure and get one next time you're here, or you can ask and we'll have one sent to you. Don's very forward-looking. So I close by saying this: only, oh, if these walls could talk, if they could tell you what's happened. Yes, I know the church is not a building. The church is people. But within these walls, we've had communion and powerful music, weddings, life decisions, victory over addiction, renewed dedication. And some of our groups, like preschool, children, youth, adult classes, scouts, United Women in Faith, are keeping on with the ministry of the church as an additional part of our work of serving God here. I end with saying that the church is not a building. The church is not a steeple. The church is not a resting place. The church is a people. I am the church. You are the church. Church together. We follow Jesus all around the world. Yes, we're the church together. Thank you for your attention, and God bless you. Amen.